So the war has ended. April 9th, 1865, General Lee formally surrendered to General Ulysses S. Grant. Unfortunately, if you know something about the time frame, you know that Lincoln is not going to gain the opportunity to guide nation through the Reconstruction process. John Wilkes Booth was an actor, and he had developed a firm hatred of Lincoln and his policies, and this is in stark contrast to his older brother, who was a Shakespearean actor, and his performances were greatly enjoyed by Lincoln, and his brother had remained loyal to the Union. Booth had formulated a plan to capture Lincoln and bring him to Richmond, and he was going to try and leverage him to end the war, but really the end of the war made this move. He heard Lincoln give a speech in which he was endorsing citizenship for all freedmen, and this would later become part of the 14th Amendment. So this enrages Booth, and he and two other conspirators resolved to kill Lincoln. The plan called for Booth and 3 conspirators to assassinate 3 targets. You had President Lincoln, Vice President Johnson, and Secretary of State William Seward. The night of April 14, 1865, so 5 days after the war ended, that night would be the best opportunity to carry it out, because it was widely known that Lincoln would be attending Our American Cousin at Ford's Theater, and Booth's connections would allow him to enter backstage to kill the president. So Booth is going to Ford's Theater. Seward's assassin was a large, hulking man who entered his home in Lafayette Square, and he scuffled with the military detail assigned to protect Seward, and Seward's cheek was slashed with a large Bowie knife, but his assailant got away. Now, interestingly enough, Vice President Johnson was staying at the Kirkwood Hotel, and he was supposed to go up to his room and assassinate him. His would-be assassin decided that the plan went a little bit too far, because he famously said that he had agreed to capture but not kill. That's where he drew the line. So he left the hotel, didn't return. Lincoln's bodyguard had left his post to go to a nearby tavern, and Booth entered the box after presenting his calling card to the footman. He raised a pistol to the back of Lincoln's head, and he fired. He then leapt onto the stage from 15 feet above and yelled out, "Sic semper tyrannis," thus it ever be to tyrants. And he ran away, and at first people were astounded. They didn't really know what was going on. They thought it was maybe part of the show. Booth was well known enough. Unfortunately, he got away, and Lincoln was carried across the street to the Peterson boarding house. Now, word of Booth's attack spread quickly throughout Washington, and Lincoln's cabinet, as they heard, crowded into the Peterson boarding house. Word of Lincoln's assassination even spread to a nearby theater that was staging a production of Aladdin, which is where Lincoln's son unfortunately was when he heard the news. Booth was cornered into a barn in Virginia where he shot himself, and 4 total people were hanged for their roles, while Jefferson Davis actually knew nothing of it. That night, Secretary of War Edwin Stanton had spent the whole evening dictating messages through the War Department so that generals would be aware of the situation. And after Lincoln was shot, he died the next morning at 7:22. Stanton was reported to have said that now Lincoln belonged to the ages. Flags were at half-staff until the last week of May in the nation's capital. And in that week, Stanton had orchestrated a 2-day march of the 200,000 Union soldiers in honor of Lincoln. The first day was dedicated to the Army of the Potomac, while the Army of the West was led by General Sherman the following day. During the march, Stanton claimed that you see in these armies the foundation of our republic. And he wasn't wrong, because 5 of the next 7 presidents were veterans of the Civil War. But realistically, in the short-term future, the U.S. was going to need to figure out how to move on from this deadly 4-year conflict. So overall, when we look at 4 years of carnage, what have we learned? We've learned that in the U.S., This was referred to as the first modern war because of technological advancement. Fast-loading rifles replaced more obsolete weapons, and the mini-ball was such a powerful bullet that it would break the bone upon impact. Wooden ships gave way to ironclad vessels like you see on screen, and they had more sturdy sides. Early in the war, the Confederate ironclad Merrimac dueled with the Union ironclad Monitor, and the two ships bombarded each other with cannon fire for hours. The Merrimac's commander realized that they couldn't outmaneuver the Monitor and simply went back to friendly waters, although the Monitor's commander was injured in the scuffle. Now, the incident is a clear example of the technological advantage enjoyed by the Union, because, for example, even though the South used railroads to transport goods and troops first, the Union laid more miles of track and requisitioned the lines for military purposes, whereas the South did not. The War Department was wired with telegraph cables, so Lincoln spent hours in the War Department, reading up-to-the-minute messages about the combat, and even providing generals with tactical advice. Photographs, beginning with Matthew Brady's New York exhibit on Antietam, brought images of war into the homes of Americans for the first time. Now, the quote on screen is apt. It was often stated that the Civil War was a 19th century war, fought using 18th century tactics and 20th century technology. The slaughter was unimaginable. About 750,000 Americans died. So that's 2.5% of the population. And if that same statistic was applied today, we're talking about 7 million Americans. This tells us that in war, it often takes time for tactics to catch up to the technology. One of the reasons why Antietam was such a slaughter was that you still had troops engaging in shoulder-to-shoulder line fighting and slaughtering one another in the process. Meanwhile, by the end of the war, at Cold Harbor, for instance, the Confederates used trench warfare, really foreshadowing how brutal World War I was going to be. Now, our final lesson, unfortunately, gives us an idea of how cruel humans can be in war. Now, the first thing you see is Fort Pillow. In April 1864, a Confederate officer named Nathan Bedford Forrest led a force to Fort Pillow, Tennessee, and drove the defenders from the fort. Hundreds of the troops, many of them free black soldiers, were massacred, outright massacred after surrendering. Lincoln didn't take any action on it, given that the current wilderness campaign took precedence, and this really demonstrated the ferocity with which Confederates would resist future Reconstruction measures. Now, the treatment of Union men at Andersonville, the prison camp you see on screen, was also indicative of the struggle between both sides. This is a POW camp in Georgia that was designed to hold 10,000, but had 32,000 men at its peak. In the summer of 1864, because this thing didn't open until early 1864, but in that summer, one man died every 11 minutes. And throughout the course of the war, 16,000 Union prisoners died at Andersonville. The chief surgeon, Dr. White, was known to amputate regularly without anesthesia or whiskey. And the treatment at Andersonville was so atrocious that Captain Henry Wirz, the Swiss commander of Andersonville, was the only Confederate executed at war's end for war crimes. And both of these events truly demonstrate that reconciliation between North and South is not going to be as easy as simply ending the fighting.